Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the warm reception. I hope it's going to be a nice evening. Please allow me to introduce my guest tonight. Timothy Garton Ash is a historian, academic, writer. His most recent book is Homeland, so it's a Slovak translation. It's currently being published by Denníku N. My other guest is Veronika Munk, the co-founder and former editor-in-chief of Telex, an independent Hungarian news website, and currently our colleague at Denníku N, where she is head of innovations and new markets. Good evening to you both. Before we begin, I have a couple of practical announcements. The first one is that this debate will be in English and in English only. There will be no translation available either here or online. We try to warn you well in advance, so I hope you're okay with this setup. There will be room for questions from the audience after we finish the first part of the discussion, and that's where the streaming will end. And the last practical point is that if you're interested in buying the book that I mentioned at the very beginning, it will be possible to do so. And also Mr. Ash will be available for signing, so that will be happening somewhere at the back of the room. This short introduction, let us get to the debate. Mr. Ash, when we were having dinner, you mentioned that you lost count of how many times you visited Bratislava. Have you noticed any significant change to the city and its people over the years that you've been coming over?
The first time I 1979, so there's been a little change since 1979, I would have to say. One of the great things about, and by the way, it's lovely to be here again, one of the great things about being a European, one of the unique things, is that you can be at home abroad, right? So, 5 days ago I'm in Strasbourg, then I was in Munich, then I was in Vienna yesterday, then I'm here. Every time you know you're abroad, but you're also at home because you're European, hence the title of the book, Domoviny, Homelands. That's the great thing about being a European. And sure there have been some major changes. For example, I've known 3 generations of Šimečkas. When I came in 1979, there was Milan Šimečka, the original Šimečka. Then there was the Milan Šimečka I know as Martin, who's a very good friend. And then there was our former student at Oxford, Michał Šimečka, who I had lunch with today. So the Šimečkas have changed. But the politics have changed too, because apart obviously because of the physical appearance of the city being then very, very grey, very different from what we are today, I had to buy a power adapter for my iPhone today. So one of your colleagues took me off to your biggest shopping center. And honestly, one could have been in Kansas or Rio or, Sheffield. It was indistinguishable from a shopping center almost anywhere else in the world, but obviously the older parts of the city remain. But politically, back then in 1979, actually most people were still not yet talking about Central Europe in the present tense or the future tense. Central Europe was something way distant in the past. And then, starting very soon thereafter, we had this reinvention of the idea of Central Europe as the way in which this part of the world was going to move from the east to the west. And it was a formative experience of my life, Slovakia being part of that formative experience, to see the emancipation of this part of Europe and the way in which, through the great events of 1989, through the transitions to democracy, through becoming part of the European Union and NATO, it actually became part of the West, which is why this time when I come back, and unfortunately Mr. Fico is back, one comes a little bit worried.
Okay, we'll get to that later on. Veronika, it's been now 6 months that you work in Bratislava and you spend a lot of time here. Is there anything that still surprises you about the city or the country?
I haven't got that extended experiences with Bratislava that Timothy had. I was born in 79, so obviously I couldn't have the same kind of history with the city. And I was here like once with my parents as a tourist. So yeah, half a year ago when I started to work here, that's where I explored the city. And I can connect to you in terms of the shopping malls, because that was one of my major observations, that why so many large shopping malls in this city? Like every corner there is like half a city large shopping mall. And I tell you the truth, I didn't like it, but I tell you one thing that I truly like in the city, that is quite close to the nature in terms of there are many lakes, which I really enjoyed in the summer. And that's how the city is using the Danube. In Budapest, my hometown, the river is basically blocked by the cars. So there are like big routes going by the river, and it's not possible to go close and enjoy the nature. So yeah, those were my first observation, besides the interesting political changes since I started to work here.
You mentioned the emergence of Central Europe as a phenomenon, and you yourself claim to be a Central European, or to identify as one. How would you define that Central European identity?
Well, I think it's two things. It's, first of all, a shared historical, cultural, architectural, artistic experience, but also, for me, in my own personal biography, and the reason I say that, I quote in the book Franz Kafka, who at one point in a postcard to his fiancée said, basically I'm Chinese. Im Grunde bin ich Chinese. And I say basically I'm Central European. It's a chosen affinity, an elective affinity. And for me, it has to do with this very strong statement: we are not Eastern Europe. We don't belong in the Soviet bloc. We don't belong with Russia. And we are a European country. We embrace and want to become part of the liberal democratic West and Europe. So for me, that's at the heart of it is to be a Central European, which is why I get rather depressed these days, because for a long time in the 1990s and early 2000s, people in Western Europe and the US were very careful to talk about Central and Eastern Europe. I remember an encounter with Henry Kissinger in Warsaw in 1991, and Kissinger kept saying, "It's so nice to be here in Eastern, I mean Central." Now, people are back to talking about Eastern Europe because of the populist governments here in Hungary, in Poland, now again in Slovakia. You know, there's a whole discourse back again about how Eastern Europe was somehow always, its default position was reactionary and authoritarian. So I wish we had more talk of Central Europe and less of Eastern.
And just as a matter of definitions, which countries do you consider to be part of Central Europe?
You want me to make a list?
It doesn't have to be exhaustive.
Well, it's actually so one of the things you learn in a lifetime of studying Europe is never name a frontier, because you're always going to offend somebody, right? So I'm not going to do that because you know, for example, the Baltic states, right? So at a certain point, you know, which of them is Central European? Lithuania considers itself Central European, right? But Estonia wants to think of itself as a North European, as a Baltic country. But there's also a much more interesting sense in which Central Europe, in the political sense I'm talking about it, is a movable feast. So if you think about Ukraine, and I'm sure we'll come to Ukraine now, obviously Lviv, architecturally, culturally, historically, has a strong claim to be historically part of Central Europe. But politically, now people are talking about Ukraine as Central Europe. Even Henry Kissinger, before he died, talked about it as a Central European country, because they have in mind this sense of European countries that want to get away from the East and towards the West. So it's a movable feast.
You managed to escape the question completely. There not a single...
In the most elegant fashion, but actually accurately so.
Veronika, do you think there is anything as a shared Central European identity?
Many identities that people can have, right? But I feel like this regional identity, I don't really feel it exists. I feel more like, for instance, myself, I have this European identity, I have my Hungarianness, and if someone asks, there are many people today in Hungary, if they are abroad and they ask where are they from, they say, I'm from Hungary and I'm sorry for what's happening in our country. But at the same time, still, it's our nation, and it is somehow an important kind of being. I never usually identify myself as a Central European. If someone asks, I don't really feel that it's a thing.
Can I just add one thing to that, which is we have a problem in lots of Western universities, which is that like 35 years after the end of the Cold War, nearly, there's still this thing called Russian and East European studies, right? So institutionally in universities, you're still being lumped together. And there are very, very few places where there's anything called Central European studies. Actually, London University is one exception because Masaryk was there, and so you have a Central European chair there. My own view is that at the end of the day, all these kind of regional labels, Eastern, Central, Western, Southern, Southeastern, Western Balkans, utterly arbitrary, are pretty arbitrary. And actually what we have is, as you say, we have Europe, and in this Europe, you have very different countries and very different regions. And actually, Eastern Europe as a whole now is quite as diverse. Even East Central Europe is quite as diverse as any other part of Europe.
If you compare Slovakia to other countries of the region, are there any specific traits that you think stand out and make us unique within the region?
Well, concerningly, at a time when Vladimir Putin is waging a brutal war of recolonization against Ukraine, an experience that Slovaks, after all, had in 1968, if you look at the public opinion surveys, for example, the Globsec public opinion surveys, the level of sympathy for Russia, the fact that half the people asked in Slovakia blame the war in Ukraine on the United States, which is a totally absurd position. I mean, just in contemporary terms, Slovakia stands out for that, and that is extremely concerning.
Sadly, is this negative image offset at least to some degree by the fact that on the political level, until the change of government, we stood fairly firmly on the side of Ukraine, and even in terms of, I would say, the general reaction to the war in Ukraine, the reaction has been mostly helpful in terms of refugees and so on. So does this resonate at all at the West, or are we just, does this one
No, absolutely. Well, absolutely, but it's not just one opinion poll. It's also, if you look at media, if you look at social media, I mean, there's a genuine, we've been talking about this, a genuine phenomenon. No, of course, the big problem remains Viktor Orban, and people describe Fico as a pragmatist, but using the word pragmatist in the Russian sense, I think, of pragmatist. But also, one is terribly vulnerable to the latest political development, probably too vulnerable. So when Zuzana Chaputova was elected, we all said, that's wonderful because it's a turn away from populism in Central Europe. And then when Fico come back, we all say, oh, this is terrible. And we're probably overstating the turns in both directions.
Veronika, when it comes to the Hungarian perspective or the Hungarian public discourse, and is Slovakia unique in any way when you compare us to other countries of the region, such as I don't know, Poland, the Czech Republic, and so on? Do we have a special place in any way?
It's really hard to make a generalization, a general answer to that, because the Hungarian society and public sphere is so extremely polarized, so extremely bipolar, the views of the people. So if you, as you would say, two different realities in the country, and if you talk to one side of the country, you could get another kind of answer for basically any questions you ask, even this. But generally speaking, historically there were many tensions between the two countries, and it is in the collective psyche of the Hungarians, I believe. But at the same time, if I would list the characteristic, what is stereotypically Hungarian, I think many Slovaks would feel that I list the Slovak characteristics. I see much more similarities than differences in the two nations.
You mentioned over dinner that, for example, the case of Hedviga Malinova is something that resonates still very, very intensively within Hungary, even with maybe across the political spectrum and the divide. What are other instances that sort of define modern Slovakia besides this one unfortunate case? Yeah,
Malina Hedvig's case was a really important one, and it's still cited as a crucial key element of the relations of the two countries, and when the president was stopped by the border, Mr. Solyom, in the 2000s, that also was burnt into the memory politics, and the fact that when the Orbán government wanted to create the dual citizenship, what they did in Romania, in Transylvania, for the Romanian Hungarians, they can have the possibility to have dual citizenship, but it was not allowed. In Slovakia, that's also usually it's a case which usually comes up when there is some kind of especially pro-governmental discourse regarding Slovakia.
Okay, so not very many positive associations, I'm afraid.
But the knedli, I don't know how we say the thing.
Knedla?
Knedla, yeah.
And that's associated with Slovakia somehow. Yeah. I think the Czechs have a strong claim on that, to that. So, okay, but fair enough. But given the circumstances, we have to take what's on offer. To what extent do you think that democracy is a part of the Central European identity?
Well, as I've described it, it was a central part of the Central European project. So the project of the last 50 years was about democracy. And I mean, my spontaneous response to that is to go back actually to Czechoslovakia, because I certainly think of the Masarykian project, to which, of course, Václav Havel was a great heir, as being distinctively a democratic project. But as a historian, if you look at the history of the region, you wouldn't say this is a region which is quite clearly identified with, democracy, because it has a very variegated history with a lot of authoritarianism in it. So that I think the self-identification with Central Europe makes a statement about democracy, right? Do you see what I mean? But I don't think it's a case that empirically, as a historian, looking at the history of this region, however we define it, it has a unique, distinctive democratic heritage.
One of the major developments in Central Europe were the results of the Slovak, but more importantly, maybe the Polish elections. Do you think there was ever a realistic chance that Poland could go the way of Hungary?
So this is obviously something I spent a lot of time on because, you know, as I said, the emancipation of these countries and their transitions to democracy were an important part of my life. And what I would say is this: state capture had gone fairly far under peace in Poland, under Kaczynski. But it was still an illiberal democracy rather than a competitive authoritarian system. So there's a qualitative difference. An illiberal democracy is a liberal democracy in decay. Orban is a whole step further. I would say Hungary is no longer a democracy. It's a competitive authoritarian system. But the danger was that if peace got the third term, they would go that extra mile, because it's absolutely clear that their whole project was Urbanization à la Polonaise. I mean, they were absolutely following the Hungarian textbook. It's absolutely clear. Which is why the 15th of October this year was one of the best evenings I've spent this year. I was in Warsaw. It was an amazing result. I went to the polls with the same Polish friends who I went to vote with on the 4th of June 1989, the election that effectively ended communism in Poland. And the friend I went to the polls with said to me, but the difference is, this was as we were going to vote. I mean, they were going to vote. I didn't vote. I wish I could have, but I didn't. They said, you know, the difference is, back then in 89, the prevailing emotion was hope. Now it's fear. So people were going there, they were extremely anxious because they thought that if PiS wins again, that's it, and we're going the Hungarian way. So 9 p.m., the first election polls, wow, amazing. And what's so beautiful about it is not just the fact that a democratic opposition could win an election that was procedurally free, but definitely not fair, because it wasn't a fair election, but how they did it. So 4th of June 1989, when the Poles had the chance to end 40 years of communist rule, only 62% of people turned out to vote. 15th of October this year, 74%, 12% more people. More women than men, unheard of, the first time in Polish history. By the way, someone did a little study which showed that if only the men had voted, peace would have got back in. So thank you, women. And amazingly, more voters under 29 than over 60. This is unheard of in Europe. All over Europe, the old vote more than the young. And so it was not just the fact of that amazing result, that really important consequential result, but also the beautiful way in which it happened.
How were the results viewed in Hungary? Did the opposition draw any hope from those results? And on the other hand, was Orbán concerned about the results?
Yeah, a year before this the Polish elections results, the Hungarian opposition tried something similar. So basically, first time in history, they stick together, all of the oppositional parties. They didn't have any other agenda and any other political saying regarding how they're gonna be reforming the educational system or the health system or any important problematic stuff in the country. Their only political message was that no Orbán, and they were not successful. So, of course, there was a large attention towards the Polish elections this year, and not just from the news junkies like myself, that it was widely covered in many all of the still remaining independent outlets in my country. There was no real governmental commenting on that. But yeah, there are some voices, and if you don't mind, if I ask something if I steal your role a little bit, so there was some voices that how optimist can we be with the Polish results, since it's a super fragile coalition with nine different parties with very, very different views about the world, and how can they work together? Because in the Hungarian version, when political analysts talk about the possibility that the oppositional forces who stick together gonna win, they sometimes said that they won't last a year because they will always debating and eating up each other. My question is that how do you say, is it gonna happen in Poland or not?
So it's a great question. I was actually there in April last year in Budapest on the night, and I can tell you the opposition coalition didn't even last to election night. Because the party, there was meant to be a party in that sort of, I think it was a kind of ice rink or something. Anyway, it was the saddest party I have been to in my life, and that's saying something. Because half the opposition parties didn't turn up. And it's really interesting because you have three examples where you've had kind of opposition attempts to overthrow a illiberal democracy / electoral authoritarian system: Turkey, Hungary, and Poland. In both the Turkish and the Hungarian case, you had an ostensibly united opposition. In the Polish case, you didn't, right? There were actually 4 parties, 3 groupings. And it's really interesting that the 2 united opposition ones failed, and the one where you had a divided opposition one succeeded. So there's a kind of interesting lesson there. And it is, I think, true that, there were Polish voters who voted for the left, the Lewica, who could never brought themselves to vote for Donald Tusk, because they see him as a kind of terrible neoliberal. And there were conservative voters, Catholic voters, who could never possibly have voted for the left. So I think it actually maximized the vote. The other difference is that the Poles had a really good politician as their leader, and you didn't in Hungary. And in Turkey, too, they had a weak leader. So leaders really matter, okay? And Tusk, is a great politician, and he has the killer instinct. To your question, I actually think it's 4 parties in 3 groupings. And obviously there are egos and there are personalities and there are quite big ideological differences. I think it's going to hold. And they have a big majority. And I think the difficulty is not going to be so much inside the governing coalition, but in undoing state capture in a way that conforms to European standards and the standards of the EU. Because if you remember in Hungary, you had this discussion back then, if the opposition comes to power, do you need a kind of single illegal act to restore the rule of law as a whole, because of the way the system has been tied up? And in Poland, they have a bit of that problem, right? That if you do it strictly according to the book, according to the law, it's going to be quite difficult to do. It's going to, the restoring the independence of the judiciary, for example, making public service television genuinely independent. And you have this President Duda, who has extensive powers of veto, who is a peace guy. So it's going to be a couple of difficult years. But my hunch is they'll do it. And I think that's going to be fantastically good news for the whole region.
The debate about the need for democratic forces to unite against the political forces that threaten democracy is very much alive in Slovakia, and it always comes up basically before every elections. Would you? And usually, I would say even my colleagues or our newspaper promotes unity as an answer to that. So would you say it's a general rule that it's better, that it appears to be a general rule that it's better to go fragmented and?
I think the general rule is that there is no general rule. I think you have to look at the specific circumstances and at the electoral system and at the kind of range of opinion you've got there, and then decide what's going to be best in this case. So I was also rather kind of dogmatic, it's always better to get the opposition united. I was urging my Polish friends to unite, but actually now, with hindsight, I think it was better that they remained in this 3-party format. But what you also need to do, I think, there's a lot of experience suggests this, and I'd like to hear what Veronika thinks about this. You can't simply have a kind of defensive democracy message. I think it's a mistake if you don't have a positive narrative of your own, because then you're leaving the populists are offering some kind of a positive narrative, and we're defending democracy, we're defending the rule of law, we're defending Europe. So I think you have to go out there and have some positive story to tell.
Would you agree that in Hungary the main problem is just political tactics and bad political messaging, or do you think the problem runs deeper and there are other differences in terms of overriding values, let's say, in the society that set you apart?
Today, 2023, it's basically not a question anymore, because in the last 15 years, the whole, the electoral system was changed. Since Fidesz has a super majority in the parliament, basically they can change anything, any laws they like. And also, you were talking about state capture. And state capture happened regarding the media system in Hungary, regarding the higher education, and basically they built an extremely greatly organized, centrally managed super system, which we are not able to talk about values anymore, or about is there any problematic political tactics from the oppositional side, because the whole state capture already happened.
Yeah. Could I add something on that? I mean, two things. One is, I first got to know Viktor Orbán in 1988. I was introduced to him by János Kiss, leader of the democratic opposition there, one of the leading dissidents, great bright hope of liberal democracy, and then obviously saw him when he was our student in Oxford, and then during the funeral of Imre Nagy. And in one thing we were not wrong, we identified him as one of the most talented politicians of his generation.
And I agree.
And he is. The trouble is he used his talents to demolish democracy rather than to build it. But so individuals matter, and he mattered. The other thing is, one of the things I talk about a lot in my book is the mistakes we liberal Europeans made, the different kinds of hubris that we had in the 2000s. My particular version of that, along with a lot of my friends, was I thought by 2010, countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia were consolidated democracies. And I thought being in the EU would guarantee the future of that democracy, which is, of course, the theory, right? That's the constitutional theory of the EU. So for me, the fact that Viktor Orbán, starting already in 2010, systematically demolished democracy in Hungary, not just in spite of the country's membership in the EU, but using EU funds, using the membership of the EU, is a really, really shocking fact. And I'm struck now as I travel around the region again, I mean, Poland, Czech Republic, I've been in all 4 or 5 countries over the last year, how secondary a factor the EU is, right? And there are very, very few people, I don't know if you'd agree, there are very, very few people who have any more confidence that the EU is such, is going to be a major force in saving your democracy.
Okay, so if it's not the EU, what is it? What do you think needs to happen in the instance of Hungary, since we were talking about Hungary, in order for the country to return to democracy?
Well, first of all, I haven't given up hope of the EU. I think a lot of people here have, because actually, I've been banging on about this for years and years, and the key thing is to make the linkage between the Europe of values and the Europe of money, right? It's the argument of the money that actually hits home and actually hits a regime. And we were just beginning to make this linkage in 2019, 2020, 2021. It was just beginning to get serious. And then Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, you needed Orbán and whoever Kaczynski and whoever, 4 successive rounds of sanctions on Russia, etc., so that actually it was knocked off course. But I haven't entirely given up hope that at some point we'll get back to being serious about that linkage. Meanwhile, it's up to you. You need good political organization, mobilization, as in the Polish case, smart strategy, and those elections are winnable. In the Hungarian case, well, I'd like to hear from Veronika on this, but it's clearly going to be much more difficult because the system is so much more entrenched. But I would remind you that even Slobodan Milosevic was actually toppled, not by a revolution. He was toppled at an election.
So, Veronika, this does not sound as a very good precedent, to be honest, but what do you see as a solution to the situation in Hungary?
If I would know. EU is a good question because according to all of the opinion polls, Hungarians are super pro-EU. So if you research that if you like to be in the European Union or not, the majority of the Hungarians would say yes. And at the same time, the government also is pro-EU because of the funds arriving from the Union. So if I could guess if Hungary would remain in the European Union for a long time, I would say yes, because of these 2 factors. But at the same time, in the last couple of years, the EU approach changed towards Hungary because the rule of law problems and because of keeping some funds, and that's how trying to influence the so-called illiberal democracy. But
yeah, so if I may, I mean, that's what we were starting to get serious about it. And actually, in the Polish election, the fact that 35 billion euros were being withheld did play some role. I mean, Donald Tusk said, "I'll get you the European funds," but the trouble is, then the Ukraine war starts, the war in Ukraine starts, and if you remember last year, in order to get 18 billion euros for Ukraine, Viktor Orban extracted 6 billion euros for Hungary, and I'm very afraid that the European Council that's coming up, we're going to have something similar in order to get the opening of negotiations for Ukraine. Orban will again extract some billions of euros, so that I don't think one can be too overconfident on that. The other thing to say is, there was a time when people like Orban and Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders were playing with the idea of Hungexit and Frexit and Nexit of their countries leaving the European Union. The Brits have cured them of that. I mean, me personally, my compatriots, have given you an example of what happens when you leave the European Union. But actually, in a way, what you face now is slightly more dangerous. They're not going to be so stupid as to try and leave the EU. They're going to try and wrench the EU quite sharply to the nationalist xenophobic right from inside. That's the new agenda of Orban and Wilders, and obviously Fico would be part of that, and Le Pen. And in a way, that's an even bigger threat to the EU. And I'm extremely worried about the European elections coming up next year.
In Slovakia, we very often seem to start walking away from democracy, but then at crucial moments we sort of get back on track or steer back. Do you think there is some scientific explanation for that, or is that just pure luck? And if it's just luck, can it ever run out?
Well, luck can always run out, can't it? No. No, I think it's thanks to the great work of people like Denníku N in keeping people informed, and our former student, Michal Šimečka. I think it's because people remain active in the defense of democracy. I think it's your good work. But the other thing I would say is, I mean, one good thing is that 3 years ago, Viktor Orban felt that he could speak in the name of Central Europe, right? So if you look at his speeches, at that time he was talking about these, anti-liberal, reactionary, nativist values, Christian Europe, no LGBTQ, Islamophobic, and describing them as the values of Central Europe. And he can no longer do that, thanks to Zuzana Čaputová, thanks to what's happened in the Czech Republic, thanks to what's happened now in Poland. So he can't speak in the name of Central Europe. The other thing I would say to your question is, this part of Europe has always, to some extent, responded to larger trends across the continent, right? So I think you also have to ask about the larger trend. If Marine Le Pen became the next president of France, you already have a post-neo-fascist prime minister of Italy. The AfD is doing extremely well in Germany. Geert Wilders won the election in Netherlands. If you get this pan-European trend going sharply to the anti-liberal right, that has to have an impact here too.
The new government is up to a very, I would say, dynamic start. We're seeing a major overhaul of the judicial system. Fico is meeting with the Russian ambassador. There are attacks on the media. There are like too many fronts open at this point. What do you think are the absolutely key things we should be focusing on if we want to preserve democracy? Because obviously, it's maybe impossible to be focusing on everything at once.
So, I would almost want to defer to you because you know the situation here much better. And again, one has to look at the specifics. I would actually take the list of what Orban did in Hungary and read across to the situation in Slovakia. So media is obviously crucial. The politicization of the state administration is obviously crucial. But maybe the biggest single threat would be the changing of the electoral law, because you have an unusual, very simple electoral law, nationwide proportional representation, which is itself actually a protection of democracy, right? Because it reflects the will of the voters every time. Now, as you know better than me, what Orban has done is very systematically to change the electoral law and gerrymander the constituencies, so you don't get a fair reflection of the will of the people. So maybe the biggest thing you might want to watch out for is changing the electoral law.
Mm-hmm. So, Veronika, Orban's list, is this indeed the biggest concern?
Actually, these are the most important factors that you should be surprised knowing that Fico sees Orban as a Reporters Without Borders organization. The list of length out of like 168 countries. Now we are 72nd. We are in the Sierra Leone, and we are the last country among the EU countries. And if you have a media system like that, and if the state and the government can capture the vast majority of the media organizations, it's super easy to distribute the political messages, and it's super convenient to basically change the beliefs and the views of people.
Add one thing? Sorry, I can just add one thing on that. I think of Hungary, the idea of the Potemkin village. I think Hungary is a Potemkin state because this whole thing has been done behind a facade of complying with European standards. Fidesz has a whole army of brilliant lawyers who can point to the fact that media pluralism, on paper it looks like pluralism, nothing of the kind, because media is controlled not by cronies, by crony oligarchs of Orban. As formalistic in the criteria applied on rule of law, and look at how the system So I would like to see the EU having a much broader definition of what is needed, to preserve democracy, and just being a hell of a lot more realistic.
You mentioned the case of Hedvig. Happened during that time, the dual citizenship that was going on at that time, and now they seem to be best of friends, or they seem to be close. How do you explain this transformation, and do you think they can actually form a tandem which can become a threat for greater Europe and its unity?
This friendship, I think, it's pure. They would like to be allies in the European Union, so I see it as a political tactic, and I see they truly share these conservative/populist values. So my opinion is that they can be strong together, but at the same time, they lose Poland. It seems the other important former ally of Hungary in the EU. So their strength is a little bit smaller than used to be. That's my opinion.
We already mentioned Ukraine. How, regardless of whether we consider it to be a part of Central Europe or not, how do you think the war in Ukraine transforms Central Europe?
Well, transform Europe as a whole, if not the world. I mean, one of the things I argue in the book is that there is a distinctive era of European history, which is what I call the post-wall period. There's the post-war period, and then there's the post-wall period, which begins with the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989, and ends on the 24th of February 2022 with Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think it's that big a development. And beginnings are always important. So those first few years after 1945 shaped the history of Europe for the next 50 years. And those first few years after 1989 have shaped the last 30 years. So how we begin this new period is going to shape our lives for decades to come, right? And an absolutely essential part of that is whether we succeed in helping Ukraine to something that can plausibly be called victory, and therefore also to its path into the EU and eventually, I would hope, into NATO. Now, at the moment, the war is not going well. Despite the level of Western support, the counter-offensive has won back relatively little territory. I was in Lviv in a rehabilitation clinic for wounded soldiers about 6 weeks ago, men without one leg, without two legs, without an arm, without two arms, without a hand, without a foot, because of these terrible Russian minefields. I mean, enormous, deadly minefields. Many of them, by the way, had lost their limbs after the minefields had been cleared, because the Russians are just throwing down so many mines that there's still a lot left. And they were describing just how difficult it is to make significant progress over those minefields and then these Russian lines of defense, and the Russians are good at defense. At the same time, US support for Ukraine is clearly significantly diminished. It's way down in public opinion. It's got caught up in the hyper-partisan politics on the Hill in Congress. And now you have the Israel-Hamas war, right, which clearly is a high competes for diplomatic attention, funding, and so very difficult situation on the ground. General Zaluzhny said this in The Economist the other day, diminishing US support. If we think, as I do, that this era has to begin with something that can plausibly be called victory for Ukraine, the conclusion is clear. We in Europe have to do more. So I think, really, over the next few months, we in Europe have to step up our support, both economic but also military, so that we don't get to the situation of a year from now when Ukraine has still not made significant territorial advances. People are even more exhausted and frustrated in Ukraine, and maybe we then get President Trump. And Trump would, of course, be the ultimate disaster for Ukraine.
Do you think there is a realistic chance for what you're describing? I mean, especially given the situation in Europe. For a long time, Orbán was probably the only European leader who was, if not pro-Russian, then I would say hesitant in his support. Europe can, in fact, step up, as you were describing it.
Well, I'm told that even Fico, who famously said he wouldn't want to send, is in practice being, shall we say, somewhat pragmatic in his attitude to arms supplies through Slovakia. But I think the bigger problem is the US. I think on the whole, European support is holding up. There was a survey in Germany recently which said 67% still support weapons supplies to Ukraine. So I think the broad support, and you know, all our heads of government, except for bloody Viktor Orban, have been to Kiev. Ursula von der Leyen is there every second Thursday. I mean, you know, the sort of, we are very committed in a way as Europe to our support for Ukraine, and it's a candidate for membership of the EU. The question is, at a very difficult time economically for us, with energy prices and inflation and all the other problems we have, are we prepared to do that bit more, which would be needed maybe to make a breakthrough? And there one has to have some doubts.
Today we had a piece by Timothy Snyder who argues that even if Trump wins, Europe could, in theory, at least support Ukraine and its own and do it successfully. Do you think that's realistic at all if we see a turnaround in the US?
Tim Snyder is a great friend of mine, and honestly, if the US just pulls the rug out from under Ukraine, it's very difficult to see Europe. I think European attitudes, what you're hearing more and more of in European governments, is a kind of deal and some kind of a negotiation. So I think those voices are getting a little bit louder, but you know, it's nothing compared to the impact of to the diminishing American support and the impact of a potential Trump victory.
The position of Orbán, who really from the beginning, I would say lukewarm in his support of Ukraine. Is it the case the overriding sentiment in the Hungarian society, or what is the position of the...
Regarding the war?
Yes.
Well, again, polarized. It was super interesting in the beginning when the war started, and but then it all changed since Hungary is a EU and NATO country. The thing inside the country for the voters, and they playing with this. But answering your question, since there is a large Hungarian minority, there are many. There is a extended amount of people and have connections to the people Carpathian region. Well, I would say that that according to the polls, all like pro-Ukrainian, of course, but at the same time, somehow Orban make people believe that Putin and the energy that's coming from Russia and is somehow helping the people. So that's why these bipolar aspects that the Hungarian society is pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian at the same time it's still there. It's a polarized opinion, like every issue.
Yeah, you mentioned the Slovak attitudes towards Russia. We Slovaks struggle to explain why it is, why our compatriots have the attitudes they have. What do you think, as an outsider? What's the explanation for the high degree of support?
I have to ask you. I honestly find it. You're right up against it. It's just next door. You have the experience of a Russian invasion only a few decades ago. Find it. We talked a little at dinner. You have more theories than I do, but the one thing I would say, if we're talking about Slovakia in the round, being promoted on social media, and I think I mentioned at the beginning, it does seem to be the case that Slovakia, through social media, is particularly vulnerable to disinformation and to Russian. Effective these are. So it does, this is not a specifically as a but it does show you just how dangerous social media can be, because then you ask, is Facebook? And then you ask yourselves, why are these lies, why have they got proving so effective, these narratives? The answer is because of algorithms that are being determined in Silicon Valley, algorithms that optimize for attention, and therefore stuff that is sensational or bloody or conspiratorial gets attention and therefore is promoted even more. So there's an answer to the puzzle of Slovak public opinion, which oddly enough is many thousands of miles away from Slovakia in Silicon Valley. And I do think, you know, getting the big platforms to be more responsible in that is really quite key to the democratic future.
For a second, you always seem to be in places where history is being written. How do you do it? What's the trick?
Well, wanting to be there is part of it. That certainly helps. I've been doing this for 50 years. My motto is there's nothing to compare with being there. And I do this strange mixture of history and journalism. So I think most academic historians, their first thought when something is happening is not necessarily, I'm going to jump on a plane, ruefully observes. So, you know, seeing it as part of one's job as a historian of the present. Machiavelli says fortuna is 50% of everything that happens in politics. And there was a lot of luck in the fact that I made Central Europe my particular study. So these days I have students who come to me in my room in Oxford and say to me, you know, you saw so many great events and so on and all of that. Where should I go? As if I had been sort of speculating on the stock market of world affairs and doesn't have a skillful, but Central Europe, that's the place to go. Not a bit of it. I just found this place fascinating and it spoke to my heart, so I kept coming here. So what I say to them is, follow your heart. And maybe it'll turn out to be the place where world history is made, as it was in Central Europe. But even if it doesn't, you'll still have followed your heart.
Many of the people, or most of the people here, haven't had the chance to read the book. Veronika, you have. What were some of the interesting parts that you found most amusing or interesting, and why would you recommend it?
I really enjoy the part that you just mentioned, that it seems that you are everywhere. I asked at the dinner that how you logistically do it, that you basically happen to be every important historical events all time, and it's extremely well written, and it's lovely how the personal history of yours is combining with the history of Europe, and yeah, I really could recommend to anyone, basically from a very early age, from I don't know, from 15 years or 14 years, kids could start to read if they would like to have a sense that how is our continent's history look like. So I really recommend everybody to buy it today and have a chance to have a signature of Mr. Ash's. And and if I may to ask some more logistical question regarding the book, that how you mentioned this notebook many times in the book, and super okay. I want that's how I wanted to see that how small it is or big it is, and logistically how can you do it, that if you are everywhere you like bringing a larger or smaller notebook, but yeah.
These are my favorite notebooks, and I probably write down something from this evening. And actually on my website I have a video showing all the notebooks from the last 50 years. I had to lay them out all the way up. We have quite a tall house, and I had to lay them out all the way up the stairs of the house because there are so many of them. But if I may just say one thing about the book and the kind of spirit in which it's written. I think we have a whole generation of young Europeans who take the Europe we have today, a European Union of 27 member states, most of them, with the exception of Hungary, still democracies. The fact that on a Friday morning you can wake up and say, I'd like to go to Athens or Helsinki or Lisbon and just jump in a budget airline, EasyJet, preferably not Ryanair, and fly to the other end of the continent. And if you meet someone there, you can settle down and you can get a job, or you can live there, or you can study there. And by the way, you may be using the same currency. I think they take that as normal. And the thing we have to keep reminding ourselves is, in historical perspective, this is profoundly abnormal, deeply abnormal. I mean, even when I started traveling in Europe in the early 1970s, most Europeans were still living under dictatorships. Spain, Portugal, and Greece were still dictatorships, not to mention the whole of Eastern Europe. So, this Europe that we think of as normal is actually quite extraordinary. And it's very seriously under threat. This thing can unravel quite quickly, as we saw in former Yugoslavia and in Ukraine. So that was one of the motivations was writing the book, saying to people, this is actually the best Europe there's ever been, and we need to mobilize to defend it.
In Slovakia, when you tell young people to follow their hearts, most of them, get up and go study and work abroad and never come back.
Yeah.
Do you think we should just wish them the best of luck and respect their decision, or do you think we should try to convince them to come back and fight against the threats you mentioned and fight for democracy? What do you think is the strategy for that?
So listen, Lukáš, I think this is a huge unintended consequence of this project of a Europe whole and free. The famous line is, it's much easier to change countries than to change your own country, right? So all over Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe and Central Europe, you have this phenomenon. And actually when, if you look at the numbers in Hungary, this has been documented. I mean, I have my former student, Martin Benedict, who you may have come across, tells me that when he goes back to Budapest, there is not a single school friend of his left there. They've all left, right? Lithuania, it's huge. Bulgaria, it's huge. Even here, it's quite. In fact, the Slovak ambassador in London was telling me that I think, I may have got this figure wrong, but I think it's like something like 1% of the population of Slovakia is in Britain. It's something like that, and 2.5% of the population of Lithuania are in Britain. So it's a large. Now it's very difficult, since these people are using, the freedom which is what Europe is about, to make better lives for themselves and their families. It's very difficult to tell them not to. But yes, I would like people. Having said all of that, I would like to encourage people to come back and try and improve the condition of their own countries. I actually sat next to someone in Prague the other day who has a really interesting project. I don't know if you have this here, which is saying you don't actually have to come back for good and settle back here and, bring your whole family back, but do something for the country. Maybe come back for a few weeks, maybe have some joint projects and so on. So yeah, I think it would be great if people who are living in other parts of Europe did more for their own countries.
I just have a short comment on that the Hungarian government have a program like that, titled "Please Come Home, Young People," and they give scholarships away. It's not super successful, but it exists.
Okay. I think this is a nice idea to finish the first part of the debate. I would at this point like to thank my guests, Veronika Munk and Timothy Garton Ash, and thank you all for coming. And we can now stop the stream and